The first thing Stuart Voss noticed about the alien body was that it breathed wrong. Not wrong like a malfunctioning machine. Wrong like a mouth that had learned the shape of speech but never understood what sound was for. Two lungs that filled from the bottom up, the way a glass fills with water rather than the way a bellows works. And every inhale came with a faint harmonic hum at the back of the throat, a resonance his human larynx wasn't built to produce. He stood in the continuance booth for longer than protocol allowed, just breathing, trying to memorize the wrongness so he'd know when it was gone. The booth attendant, a Theresi female, gray-skinned, triple-jointed at the elbow, wearing the white coverall that all continuance staff wore regardless of species, tilted her head at the angle that indicated polite impatience. "Mr. Voss, the transition is complete. You can step out whenever you're ready." He stepped out. The body he was wearing had belonged 20 minutes ago to a mid-level continuance transit coordinator named Drevas. It was the standard corporate package, humanoid enough for Voss to operate without a manual, tall, heavier than his own frame by about 15 kilograms, with 6 fingers on each hand that his brain kept miscounting. The Theresi used continuance travel for the same reason humans had started using it 8 years ago. It was faster than any physical transport system, and speed was money in any language the galaxy had invented so far. Consciousness transfer. Mind over matter, the ad campaign said. Because humans loved a pun even in the middle of a revolution. You climbed into a booth, consented to the extraction, and your mind wrote a tight beam carrier signal to a compatible host body at the destination. The host's mind took a guided sleep in the interim. Nobody was harmed. Nobody was inconvenienced beyond a mild dissociation hangover that cleared in about an hour. The Theresi Continuance Corporation had patented the technology 11 years ago and licensed it to 62 member worlds of the hegemony, and Stuart Voss's employers at Transgalactic Partners had been clients for 6 of those years. He had used the system exactly 3 times before today. He was a reluctant floater. That was the slang for people who traveled by mind rather than body. And he had only agreed to this trip because the alternative was 6 weeks in transit aboard a carrier ship. And the Theresi board meeting couldn't wait 6 weeks. He would later reflect, agreed to things he did not fully understand. That was a human habit the galaxy had not yet managed to cure. The continuance office on Theresi Prime was a low building of pale composite material, enormous by human standards, modest by Theresi ones. Voss collected his credentials from the front desk, flagged a transport pod, and spent the ride to the Commerce District, staring out the window at a city that had been old before Earth's first cities were founded. The Theresi had been crossing their own star system for 3,000 years, before humans crawled out of their atmosphere. The architecture showed it. Everything was built for permanence, for the 10-generation view, with the kind of patient confidence that only comes from a civilization that has never once seriously doubted its own survival. He used to find that beautiful. He was starting to find it unsettling. The Commerce District smelled of ozone, and something floral that the local guides said was actually a chemical warning signal the Theresi secreted when they were content. He'd read that in the briefing packet and filed it under things that would take some getting used to. He filed a lot of things there. The press reception was on the 14th floor of the Hegemony Trade Consortium building, and when the lift doors opened, the first person he saw was Mara Chen. He hadn't expected Mara Chen. He hadn't expected anyone from home. She was standing by the window wall with a glass of something amber in her hand, wearing her journalist face. That particular arrangement of features that meant she was recording everything and had already formed 6 opinions she wasn't going to share until she'd formed 3 more. She was a consumer advocacy correspondent for the Interstellar Press Syndicate, and she and Voss had a history that could be accurately described as complicated and more accurately described as 2 people who had both been right about different things at the wrong times. Stuart, she said it without surprise, which meant she'd seen them manifest. Mara. He said it without inflection, which meant he was buying time. You're floating, she said it like an accusation. You're in a Theresi body, transit coordinator, temporary. Very comfortable. Thank you for asking. You know the advocacy groups have 40 active complaints against continuance filed with the Hegemony Ethics Committee. You sent me 3 of them. I've read them, and yet I'm here. Because someone has to be. She looked at him for a moment, long enough that he felt the slight wrongness of Drevas's eyes tracking her. The focal length was a millimeter off human standard, which meant everything at middle distance had an almost imperceptible shimmer. You always were comfortable with that sentence, she said. Someone has to be. He opened his mouth to answer and the lights went out. Not the room lights, not anything so simple. The room lights stayed on. What went out was the ambient sound, the subliminal carrier hum that ran beneath every room on Theresi Prime, the constant low broadcast of the planetary continuance network. He felt it go out the way you feel a refrigerator stop running. In the sudden, revelatory silence, you realize it had been there all along. Every Theresi in the room went still at the same moment. It lasted 4 seconds. The hum returned. The Theresi resumed motion as if nothing had happened, fluid and unhurried, the way water resumes flowing after a hand is removed. But Voss had seen it, the 4-second pause, and he'd seen something else. The Theresi male nearest the far window had not paused with the rest. He had used those 4 seconds to move toward the exit, smooth and purposeful, in a direction that had nothing to do with the reception or the view. Voss filed it under things he did not understand, and followed him anyway. The corridor outside the reception hall was empty, and lit in the blue-gold spectrum that Theresi preferred for non-public spaces. The male was 20 meters ahead, walking with a precision that read as something other than hurry. Not someone who wanted to be seen rushing, but someone who knew exactly where every camera was positioned. Voss had spent 8 years in corporate transit management. He recognized the walk of a man who was doing something he planned to do. The male turned a corner. Voss turned the same corner 10 seconds later and found an empty corridor with a service access panel hanging open at the far end. He stood there for a moment in the blue-gold light, breathing Drevis's wrong-bottomed breath, counting the reasons he should go back to the reception and the reasons he shouldn't. The count came out uneven. He went through the service access. The maintenance levels of the consortium building were built for Theresi workers, which meant Voss could stand upright with 3 centimeters to spare, and the conduit runs along the walls were all at the wrong height for his borrowed arms. He followed the only sounds he could hear. Footsteps ahead of him, deliberate, unhurried, the sound of someone who believed they were alone. The footsteps stopped in a junction room. Voss stopped 10 meters back in the shadow of a conduit cluster and listened. 2 voices. One was the male from the reception. The other was a transmission. A speaker, somewhere in the room, signal compressed, with the particular flatness of a heavily encrypted hegemony band communication. He couldn't understand Theresi. He'd never needed to. The universal translation implant he'd been fitted with upon entering hegemony space handled everything in real time. But the translation implant was keyed to his original body. Drevis's body had its own implant, calibrated for Drevis's neural architecture. He heard the cadence and rhythm of a conversation without the meaning. He heard a specific tone that the Theresi used when something had been decided rather than discussed. He heard the word that his mind from 3 years of boardroom work with Theresi partners had learned to recognize without translation. The word that meant tomorrow. He backed out carefully and made his way to an emergency communication terminal, where he pulled up Continuance's local client portal with his corporate credentials and requested an immediate return transit to his own body. The portal returned an error he had never seen before. Host body status unresponsive. There were 7 other error codes beneath it, and he read them all twice, and then he read them a 3rd time to make sure he understood what they were telling him. His body was gone. Not dead. Not returned to origin. Gone. Removed from the continuance system by an override command that required executive-level clearance. The command had been issued 4 minutes ago, during the 4-second network interruption, by an authorization code that corresponded to a continuance executive account, registered to a name he didn't recognize. He stood in the maintenance level of the consortium building in a body that wasn't his, and the particular quality of stillness that moved through him then was the kind that comes not from confusion but from a moment of complete, cold clarity. Someone had planned this. Someone had waited for him specifically, or for someone like him, a human floater, a temporary resident in a borrowed shell, a mind without an anchor. He thought about Mara's 40 complaints. He thought about the Theresi male, who had moved during the 4-second silence. He thought about the word that meant tomorrow. He went back to the reception and he found Mara Chen. She listened to all of it without interrupting, which meant she already knew some of it. When he finished, she set down her glass with a precision that said she'd made a decision. Gloria O, she said. She's a freelance transit coordinator. Been flagging irregular continuance traffic patterns for 6 months. I was going to interview her tomorrow. Then we talked to her tonight. You don't have a body, Stewart. You have a borrowed body with a return window of. She checked his wrist terminal, because apparently she already knew where to look. 9 hours before Drevis needs it back or files an abandonment complaint. 9 hours is enough. For what exactly? He looked at her. He was wearing Dravaz's eyes with their millimeter-off focal length, and she looked slightly shimmed at the edges. Slightly unreal, the way everything did in this body at middle distance. He thought that was probably appropriate. To find out what's happening tomorrow, he said, and to stop it. She picked up her bag. You always were the most irritating kind of optimist, she said. The kind that turns out to be right. Gloria Osi lived in a residential block 8 kilometers from the Commerce District, in the part of Theresi Prime that catered to long-term off-world residents. The diplomats, the embedded journalists, the corporate liaisons who had been on assignment long enough to forget what their home planet smelled like. Her apartment was small and cluttered with the technical archaeology of someone who worked in systems rather than aesthetics. Transit manifests pinned to a physical board, because she didn't trust digital displays, signal analysis equipment stacked in towers of no apparent order that nonetheless had an order, 3 coffee mugs in different states of temperature that suggested she'd been up since the previous morning. She opened the door, looked at Voss for 3 seconds with the appraising focus of someone who spent her days reading data rather than faces, and said, "You're in a Drevis model transit coordinator body, a continuance standard, but you're not running Drevis's baseline stress signature." A pause. "You're scared. Drevis's baseline doesn't do scared." "Mara told you I was coming?" "Mara texted me from the lift. Sit down, both of you." They sat. Gloria remained standing, because she was the kind of person who thought better on her feet, and she pulled a specific sheaf of printouts from a specific location in the pile that would have taken anyone else 20 minutes to find. 6 months, she said. 6 months of irregular traffic. Not irregular like random, irregular like scheduled around a schedule no one's published. Transit volumes spike on specific dates, specific routes, and the spike is always in the same direction, away from the population centers. Bodies moving out to the perimeter colonies, small numbers, enough to pass unnoticed unless you're running aggregate analysis, which continuance doesn't do, because why would they don't think anyone's looking. "What's on the perimeter?" Voss asked. "The Kashari installations," she said it flatly, like she'd had time to be afraid of it, and had moved through fear into something more workable. 3 weapons development complexes that the Theresi Continuance Corporation has been quietly funding through shell entities for 2 years. Kashari is a separatist faction. They want the hegemony's less developed member worlds released from the treaty structure. Legitimate grievance. Very illegitimate methods. Mara had gone still in the way she went still when a story resolved into something larger than she'd expected, and continuance is involved because the treaty structure is what keeps continuance's license exclusive. Break the hegemony, and 40 competing technologies enter the market inside a decade. Continuance goes from the only mine transit provider to one of 50. Gloria tapped the manifests. They're not funding separatists out of ideology. They're funding them to create a crisis large enough to require emergency treaty consolidation. More hegemony control, more continuance exclusivity, more money. "And tomorrow," Voss said. Gloria looked at him. "How do you know about tomorrow?" "I heard the word, in the maintenance level. I don't know what happens tomorrow." She picked up the top sheet. A hegemony member world summit. 31 species diplomatic representatives, all in transit via continuance for the opening session. All floating, all physically vulnerable to interference at the moment of transfer. If the Kashari faction disrupts the transit network at the moment of peak load, 31 diplomatic delegations, Mara said quietly. Consciousnesses in transit, no bodies. Some would survive. The redundancy protocols would catch most of them. But if you timed the disruption right, if you had inside access to the failsafe architecture. Gloria stopped. "This is why they took your body. You're a liability now. A human with corporate access and no fixed physical address. You can go places that registered identities can't." "Or they wanted a body," Voss said. "A human body. Something that doesn't ping the Theresi biometric network. Something that can walk into a Kashari facility and not register as Theresi." "The terrorist in your body," Mara said. "Whoever took the override command. They're using your face." He thought about that. His face, walking around on a planet where everyone could scan it and read it and track it, and he couldn't go near any of it. His face with its human baseline, standard biometrics, its corporate clearances that he'd spent 8 years building. His face doing things he hadn't agreed to. He had agreed to things he did not fully understand. He was done doing that. "The drone," he said. Gloria looked at him. In your data, the irregular traffic, was there a weapons manifest? Anything that customs in the last 72 hours? She went to the towers of equipment and extracted a tablet with the speed of someone who had already cross-referenced this exact thing. A Kashari-registered freight container. Cleared the perimeter 3 days ago. Contents declared as industrial calibration equipment. She held up the tablet. The mass profile doesn't match. It's too dense for calibration equipment. It matches a Class 4 atmospheric drone. Solar-powered standby, Voss said, almost to himself. His company had used the same class for infrastructure surveys. Once activated, they locked to a target ID and didn't let go, patient, methodical. No room for a human mistake because there was no human in the loop. They used me as the bait. They put my body, my face, at the summit location. When the disruption happens and the investigation starts, my identity is in the room, and then the drone removes the evidence. Removes you, Mara said. Removes whoever's wearing my face. With my ID tag broadcasting from my body, he stood up. 9 hours had become 8 hours 40 minutes. I need my tag. The Continuance Regional Office for Corporate Clients was a 40-floor tower in the financial district, and at this hour it ran on a skeleton staff of automated systems and 2 live attendants. Voss had his corporate credentials in Drevis's implant. Physical clearance. Because Continuance didn't rely solely on biometric scanning, for the same reason, no system should rely solely on one verification method. And he used them at the service entrance, which Mara had located on the building's public maintenance registry while they were in the transport pod. The attendant who flagged them at the secondary checkpoint was Theresi Young, clearly running a night shift boredom level that had flatlined several hours ago. He looked at Voss's credentials. He looked at Voss. You're in a transit coordinator body, he said. Standard Drevis model. I'm a floating client. My primary is in dispute. I need access to my ID management account to locate a tag broadcast. At this hour. The attendant had the particular look of someone deciding whether this was his problem. Voss had been on the other side of that calculation for 8 years, sitting across from people who were deciding whether his problem was their problem. And he had learned something about it. The calculation almost always came down to one thing. Not risk assessment, not procedure, not rules. It came down to whether the person across the desk seemed like they knew what they were doing. Confidence was a more universal language than any translation implant. He looked at the attendant with the calm of a man who had been floating in a borrowed body for 7 hours and was running out of time and had committed, somewhere in the maintenance level of the consortium building, to the idea that uncertainty was not an excuse for inaction. The attendant processed his credentials. The ID management system showed his primary tag broadcasting from a location 4.3 kilometers north of the summit venue, a Kashari-registered facility that Continuance had approved as a corporate hospitality suite. His face was there. His clearances were there. The drone, patient in its solar-powered standby mode, was locked to his tag and waiting. He needed his tag. He needed to separate his identity from his body before the summit began. Mara said, "You can't go there. You're in a Dreva's body. Biometric scan at the facility entrance will show the mismatch the moment you try to access anything." I don't need to access anything. I need to get close enough to broadcast a tag override request. Continuance protocol allows a floating client to file an emergency ID detachment if their primary tag is broadcasting from a body they're not currently occupying. Gloria had sent the relevant protocol to his wrist terminal from the transport pod. He read it now. 5-minute processing window. Required proximity of 50 meters or less to the broadcasting tag. Confirmation from any registered Continuance system terminal. 50 meters, Mara said. And a terminal. She looked out the window of the Continuance office at the city arranged in its patient permanent Theresi order. Then she looked at him. You know what the worst part of being right is, she said. It doesn't actually feel like anything. It just feels like more work. I know, he said. I've been told that's irritating. Deeply, they went. The Kashari Hospitality Suite occupied the ground floor and basement of a commercial building that had been leased 6 weeks ago, which was long enough to be unremarkable and short enough that the neighborhood networks hadn't fully integrated the new tenants into their ambient data profiles. Gloria had identified it not by looking for the Kashari directly but by finding the gap. The address that appeared in commercial records but generated no ambient data traffic, no delivery manifests, no foot traffic patterns. Empty space in a city that was otherwise entirely legible. The perimeter was patrolled by 2 individuals that Voss clocked at 80 meters. Both Theresi, both in civilian clothes. Both moving with the specificity of people who knew exactly where they were supposed to be. He had 4 minutes before the summit transit window opened, and 31 diplomatic delegations went floating through the continuance network. He had a continuance emergency terminal on his wrist, and a borrowed body with 50 meters to cover, and 2 guards between him and the tag broadcast. Mara touched his arm. Back entrance. Service alley. The building has a maintenance access. I can see the panel from here. Locked. Probably keyed to Theresi biometrics. She held up her own hand. Human. Earth standard. Not Theresi. He looked at her. You've done this before. I've covered 14 corporate investigations on 7 worlds in 11 years. I've opened a lot of maintenance panels. She paused. None of them while a drone was pointed at someone wearing my colleague's face. But the panel part is the same. She went. He counted the guards' positions and moved to the far edge of the patrol radius, keeping the guards' angles in his peripheral vision, watching the building's exterior, as Gloria had taught him to watch it. Looking for the gaps, the addresses that generated no data. The panel was on the east wall. He heard it open. He moved. The basement was dark and Theresi proportioned and smelled of the ozone and content signal that he was starting to associate with confined Theresi spaces. He found a wall terminal in the maintenance room that looked like a cleaning equipment bay and pulled up the continuance client portal with his corporate credentials. 2 minutes and 40 seconds to the transit window. The terminal confirmed his location. Confirmed his tag broadcast origin 47 meters north-northeast. The proximity requirement was met. He filed the emergency ID detachment. The processing window was 5 minutes. He had 2 minutes and 40 seconds. He stood in the cleaning equipment bay of a Kashari facility, in a borrowed Theresi body, with a hum in his lungs that wasn't quite right, and watched the timer count. Somewhere above him, in a body he hadn't consented to loan, his face was being used as a weapon. He thought about what Mara had said. Someone has to be. He'd always used that sentence like a shield, a way to make necessity sound like choice. He understood now, in the particular clarity of a basement with 2 minutes to a deadline, that they were the same thing. Necessity was choice, when you were the person in the position to act. The galaxy had 62 member worlds and 1,000 ways to be extraordinary, and humans had arrived at this particular table late and underprepared and perpetually surprised by how complicated everything was, and they had not stopped. That was the thing no one had yet managed to calculate for. Not the Theresi with their 3,000-year architecture. Not continuance with their exclusivity and their patent and their long game. Not Kashari with their drone in standby and their timer running. Humans didn't stop. It wasn't stubbornness exactly. It wasn't courage exactly. It was something more ordinary than both. The specific, persistent refusal to let the current moment be the final one. The terminal chimed. ID detachment confirmed. Primary tag status unlinked. The drone, locked to his tag, received the detachment broadcast and recalculated. A tag that was unlinked was not a valid target. Protocol. The drone went back to standby. 40 seconds before the transit window. He messaged Gloria the detachment confirmation and the facility coordinates. She forwarded it to the Hegemony Ethics Committee contact she'd been cultivating for 4 months, with the full 6 months of traffic analysis attached, and the Kashari weapons manifest, and the shell entity funding records. It was the kind of message that, once sent, could not be unsent, and it would land on the desks of 31 diplomatic delegations before they boarded their continuance booths. The transit window opened. The summit began. The 31 delegations floated to the session without incident. Voss sat on the floor of the cleaning equipment bay and breathed with his borrowed lungs until Mara came to find him. She sat down next to him on the floor, which was not something he'd expected her to do, and she didn't say anything for a while, which was also not something he'd expected. Eventually she said, "Your body is in a hegemony holding facility. They picked him up 20 minutes ago, the man wearing your face. He's in Theresi custody. Good. You're going to have to file approximately 900 forms to get it back. I know. The continuance executive who issued the override is also in custody, and about 6 people above and below them in the corporate structure. Good. Gloria is going to be very famous." A pause. "I'm going to be reasonably famous. You deserve to be." Another pause. Outside the building, somewhere in the city's patient architecture, the summit was underway. 31 species in borrowed bodies, minds floating in the continuance network, negotiating the structure of a civilization that had been in the business of civilization in for longer than human, been in the business of writing things down. He was aware that he was a very small part of a very large thing, and that his 9 hours of borrowed time had mattered in a very specific and limited way, and that there were people much more qualified than him to determine what happened next. He was also aware that he was the person who had been in the basement. That was worth something. He wasn't sure what, exactly. He suspected it was worth the same thing it was always worth. The next thing. The next conversation. The next problem. The next maintenance panel that needed opening. Mara said, "You could have gone back. When you found out your body was gone, you could have filed the complaint and waited in the continuance office." "I know. Why didn't you?" He thought about it. The honest answer was not very heroic. The honest answer was that he'd followed a Theresi male down a corridor because something had looked wrong. And then it had turned out to be wrong. And by the time he understood the full shape of the wrongness, he was already too far in to make going back feel like an option. That was probably the truth of most things that got called courage after the fact. You followed one wrong thing and then another. And you kept following, because stopping felt like abandoning something. And eventually you were in a basement with a terminal and a countdown. And it turned out you were the only person standing in exactly that spot. "Someone had to be," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That is without question the most irritating thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know." He tilted his borrowed head back against the wall. The hum in his lungs was still wrong, still that alien resonance that his human body was never going to produce. He would have it back in a few hours. He would stand in another continuance booth and feel his own lungs fill the right way. From the top, quick and practical, like a machine that had somewhere to be. He would walk out into whatever air his planet had, and it would smell like nothing particular and be exactly right. "I know it's irritating," he said. "But here we are anyway. Here they were anyway. In a galaxy that was old before humans were young. In a borrowed body in a basement, on a world that had been building for 10 generations at a time. In the aftermath of a thing that could have been catastrophic and wasn't. Because someone had followed a wrong thing down a corridor and kept going. The Theresi built for permanence. For the 10-generation view. They built with the confidence of a civilization that had never seriously doubted its survival. Humans had not yet developed that confidence. They were still, species-wide, in the phase of showing up without a plan and improvising loudly and being more trouble than they were worth, until suddenly they were exactly the right amount of trouble, at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right basement, with exactly the right borrowed hands. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't elegant. It didn't have the patient architecture of 3,000 years of certainty behind it. But it was theirs, and they weren't done. Mara stood up and held out her hand, and he took it, and she pulled him to his feet. Drevas's feet, wide and six-toed and perfectly designed for a body that breathed from the bottom up. And they went out into the blue-gold corridors of Theresi Prime and looked for the nearest continuance terminal so he could start filling out his 900 forms. He was still human somewhere in there. That was enough. It had always been enough. The galaxy was still deciding whether it agreed, and humans were still in the most characteristically human way possible, making the argument in person, one basement at a time.